of you, but it's been a monkey on the back for me ever since November. So I thought it'd be a good idea to get together with folks, and I'm really glad that the turnout and everybody who's here. We have former Mayor Bogart is here, City Manager Phil Coffey, a lot of distinguished folks. And I'm reminded about a story that Bobby Kennedy told that I heard when I was a kid. He was in a group of very distinguished academics and scholars and stuff, and he was going to talk to them about policy. And he said, it's a story of the guy who survived the Johnstown flood. An old man, he lived through the Johnstown flood, 500 people had died. And when he went up to heaven, he said to St. Peter, there's one thing I'd like to do, which is tell my story of the Johnstown flood and how I survived the Johnstown flood. And St. Peter turned to him and said, well, that's great. He said, but I should warn you, Noah will be in the audience. So we have several Noahs here. So what, can we got it?
Oh yeah?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the way what I'd like to do is, as all of you probably know, Fred Register, who's been a political consultant and leader in our community for many years. I think I'm trying to remember all the campaigns that he ran. I think Adam Schiff, plenty of others. No?
Adam escaped me.
He escaped you. Okay. But Fred was here when this was a Republican town, and we had a Republican congressperson, and a lot of that has changed. I think for the better. So what Fred and I thought we would talk about today is, since we're kind of election people, that's what we really have worked on in so many elections. And by the way, I'm the chairman. My name's Hoyt Hilsman. If you don't know, I'm chairman of the United Democratic Headquarters. So what we thought we would do is really initially talk about elections and some of the upcoming elections that we have and how they relate to the overall landscape, the whole overall political landscape. And I don't think we're going to dive into solutions to the Trump problem or how we're going to fight back against him or what we need to do, because your bet is as good as mine. Who knows what he's going to do next? We're just kind of responding as we can to it. But I think on the local level and the state and the federal level elections, I think there's a lot that we can be doing, and we just sort of wanted to give you our take on the landscape here. And I would start with a very important election that's coming up, which is Prop 50. And there's some new polling out that just came out 2 weeks ago, which I think, if you're in favor of Prop 50, is heartening. This was an Emerson poll, so 51% said they would vote yes. This is likely voters. 51% yes, 34% no, 15% undecided. And the other interesting thing about this poll is that there was an August poll a month earlier, and the undecided was 30. And at that point, we didn't know which way the undecideds were going to go. But the margin between the yes and the no vote has increased, and that's coming from the undecideds, who are going 2-to-1 to the yes side. So that's encouraging, and I think that Fred could talk a little bit more about issues like turnout and what we can expect in this very off-cycle year, but also the very kind of excited, upset kind of year. So what I'm going to do, just to leave you the logistics, is that Fred and I are going to talk a little bit about each of these issues. We maybe spend 15 or 20 minutes on that, and then we're going to engage in a conversation. So that's really the purpose of tonight, is to listen to you and to listen to your thoughts and ideas. So Fred, how's it look on Prop 50?
Well, I'm optimistic. I expect it to pass. But because we're in a new world, I don't think you can take anything like this for granted. 20 years ago, a measure like this, one measure on a mail-in ballot, would have been deemed to be very heavily weighted toward a Republican advantage. But the two parties' positions have shifted, so especially with regard to well-educated and therefore very likely voters, then I think it's clearly a good bet that it will pass. And if it does, then it will be a very significant factor for 2026, because the changes that are made in California, in some ways, I think are stronger in the partisan sense than those that were made in Texas for this election. If you think about sort of the stasis of the electorate after Trump won in 2024, the Republicans won the House vote by about 2.5%. And that translated into what we see now, a very small 5-seat majority. So the president, as we all know, has been trying very hard to find a way to improve his odds for 2026, and obviously he's made some progress. But it is, even though I think what he's doing is effective, I think there's a good chance that it will not be sufficient to overcome the changes in the electorate. Right now, the polling indicates that the electorate is leaning 2.5% to 3% on the congressional level in the Democratic direction. So that's maybe a 4 or 5% shift from 2 years ago. And given that the Democratic Party is now the party most likely to have its voters turn out in lower turnout elections, which did not used to be the case at all, that margin could easily increase. And if you get up into 5, 6, 7, 8% kind of thing, then you have what typically is a wave election, and 4 or 5 seats are typically not enough to withstand that kind of shift.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, is whether or not, I mean, even if Prop 50 fails, which I wouldn't anticipate, is the effort in Texas and Missouri and a couple of other states enough to overcome some of the inherent advantages that it looks like we may have going into the midterms?
Well, because the trend is working against the Republicans, I think they have to do more, and they are doing more. But there are things working against them. In Texas, for instance, two of the new seats that they're expecting to flip are overwhelmingly Latino. They're represented by longtime Latino politicians who are much more popular as the standard bearers than Kamala Harris was. And the national, as I said, the national field will have shifted in our direction a bit. And in addition, there's good indication that the sentiment among Latino voters, even more conservative culturally, Latino voters like those in South Texas, has also shifted against Republicans in this last year. So I think it's quite plausible that at least 2 of those 5 seats in Texas can be held.
Whether or not they are redistricted, even if they are redistricted,
they have
we
to
can
be
hold.
districted.
Yeah.
And assuming that the courts don't change.
Right.
I still think there's a pretty good chance. And there are things like in Utah where the legislature's redistricting has been ruled improper by the courts, and they're having to redraw. You know, they're creating 2 districts that are certainly not Democratic slam dunks, but they are winnable by Democrats in a state that formerly had none. So in a year, if Trump has never been terribly popular in Utah, even though it's a very conservative place. So in a year where the trend is moving in the blue direction, 1 or 2 of those seats could fall. And by contrast, in California, while the 5 seats that are being theoretically flipped here are not in any measure slam dunks in a normal year, they probably are pretty strong in a year like this one where the tide is running blue. Like there's a seat in Orange County, the Tran seat, which was won by just a few hundred votes. And the change in that district doesn't make a huge change. It adds maybe 2% to the blue side. But in a year where probably the trend is already 4 or 5% in our direction, that's probably good.
Yeah, I was going to say this is where these tiny, what seemed like tiny margins, 2, 3, 4%, really make a huge difference. Because as you probably know, about 400 of the seats in the House of Representatives are non-competitive. So you have about 35 or 40 seats. I'm sorry, you have about that many seats that are actually competitive. And I did a little research on it. And if you think about the House seats that the Republican won by 5 percentage points or less, you think we have a pretty good shot at some of those. And then even at the ones that are 10% or less, when you look at Trump's overall approval rating and the fact that the midterms may well be simply a referendum on the incumbent, there are about 40 seats, according to the Cook Report, that are either lean Democrat, lean Republican, or toss-up. 20 toss-ups and 20 that lean both either way. And those leans, you know, you figure we have a good shot at picking up the ones that are lean Democrat and an odds-on shot of the ones that are Republican. So I guess, you know, my question is, and this is just a follow-up on Prop 50, it seems to me that all the things that are going on with the redistricting and what Trump's been trying to do in the voting rights and all these other issues, these seem to be around the edges more than really where the electorate is headed as a whole.
Well, they are around the edges, but as you say, in this kind of polarized environment, the edges matter quite a lot.
Right.
I would say, though, it's easy to get too optimistic. The seats that we're looking at in California, in all honesty, we're likely to flip blue anyway. Now, no guarantees, but likely, I would say. And the thing that Prop 50 does also do is it moves about 4 seats that are held by Democratic incumbents and makes them stronger. And it really takes those sort of off the boards, or not entirely, but makes them much harder for the Republicans to win a seat here or there. And normally in this kind of, if we have a wave election, and right now it feels to me like that's likely, you normally see some upsets. You see some seats that you just didn't think could flip. And if you look at the result of special elections around the country, you see that Democrats are doing very well, typically running 10 or 12 points ahead of where they might be expected to go. That's misleading in a way, but it is also an indicator of sort of the direction of the trend.
Would you say, Fred, also that, you know, I mentioned that it's a referendum on the incumbent, which I think is always essentially true, but it may be with the kind of anti-government fervor that we're experiencing around the world, that may be even a more important factor than it would be normally in an off-cycle midterm election.
Maybe, but Trump is such a one-of-a-kind incumbent. If you notice the ads that are being run for Prop 50, they initially had some different kinds of focus, protecting democracy and so on, but now they have narrowed in to basically stop Trump. And that's because he's dominating this election. And how people feel about him is overwhelming any other issue. Now that won't be true, obviously, in the next presidential election, but in a congressional election, the fact that it's about him, but he's not on the ballot, is very significant, because a big part of the Republican coalition now, the new Trump coalition, is people who are pretty checked out of politics, don't typically vote, but vote when he's on the ballot. And how big a chunk that is, and how successfully the Republicans can get them to vote even when he's not on their ballot it will be a big difference, both for Prop 50 and in the midterms. In the past, they haven't had great success at bringing these folks out when he's not on the ballot. So
I think it's a pretty good overview of the midterms. I just want to drill down on one thing, which is the independent vote, and you talk about the low propensity voters. But what role do independents play in these elections, particularly in the off-cycle elections?
Well, it really depends on what you mean by independent. I think we have a traditional view of an independent as someone who's, sometimes this, sometimes that, reading carefully, trying to decide, do their research, so on. That kind of independent is almost non-existent now. And the people whose votes are sort of up for grabs are largely people who really have a lean in one direction or the other, and a smaller but very significant group of people who just, they are not as engaged politically, and therefore they don't have the kinds of ties and allegiances. And it's a small group because the margins are so thin, it's important, but it really emphasizes the importance of turnout. An example that I've been reading about recently, probably many of you have as well, we know that young voters really, compared to previous elections, really took a step away from the Democratic ticket 2 years ago. And what we're seeing now in the polling is that they're not happy with the Trump administration, that his numbers are very poor, and that these young voters are clearly back in the market. Unfortunately, what we're also seeing is that the Democratic brand, they're not there because of the Democratic brand.
Right.
They're there because they are unhappy with the Republican brand. So those young folks, I think in 26, to the degree that they vote, and I think many will, I think they will likely be on our side. But that doesn't mean they'll be there going forward. We have to have a message that is about where we want to go, rather than a message about who we hate.
So before I open it up, I'd also like to just talk a minute or two about the shutdown. It's ongoing, and I think there are a couple of questions up in the air. My personal view of it is that I think that healthcare is a good message. I wrote a Substack recently that said this is a battle worth losing, because I felt like one of the things that's important to do is to keep your base voters engaged, and this is an important issue to engage people. The polls are saying, if you talk about blame, and by the way, I'd be curious what Fred thinks about this, but I don't think that whatever the shutdown is, or however long it lasts, it's necessarily going to be a midterm issue. But the polling lately that says, and this is about 3 days old, 39% would blame the Trump and the Republicans, 30% would blame the Democrats, and 31% would blame both of them. So, and I think both of them is probably even more than that percentage. So I guess this is almost a tactical question in terms of the shutdown, but it's interesting too, because we have these traditional norms like our independent commission and redistricting, which we decide, okay, we need to throw it out the window because they did. And the same thing with the CRs. We're shutting down the government, even though we don't really believe that that's the right thing to do. But in return, we're going to show that we're finally somebody's standing up to this guy, and even the Republicans, and I think that's part of the audience here. Even the Republicans in the Senate and the House start to understand what a fatal issue the healthcare can be for them in the midterms, particularly if the premiums really do go up. And I don't think they give a damn about the Medicare. I don't think most voters really care whether poor people get healthcare or not. But I think when their premiums go up, they're going to be concerned about that. But your thoughts?
Well, I agree. If you were going to pick an issue, healthcare is probably the right one. Whether it's possible to come out of this with anything like a victory is dubious, I think, for either side. I would say two things though. One is that historically, shutdowns are important, they matter, they create enormous consequences for many people while they're happening and the talk of the political class. But as a long-lasting issue, they fade very quickly. And I don't expect this shutdown to be any different. The other is that we have an unstable man in the White House. And the longer this goes, the more opportunity there is for him to do something crazy. And you know, to get to crazy in Trump world, you really have to be up there. So I could conceive of him beginning to act in ways that really turn off the country, even more than they are turned off. Right. But we don't know that will happen.
And I do think that it's, at this point, it's really in the hands of the Republicans, because he's not going to listen to Democrats, he's not going to listen to the polling. It's really whether the Republicans stick with him all the way down the line. And I think that includes, and most importantly, probably elected officials in the House and Senate, particularly the Senate, because I think that he doesn't want to lose that group, because they're 90% of the Republicans are with him, and if that starts to shake, he didn't care about the rest, really, from an electoral standpoint.
I agree in general. I do think Trump has a more powerful influence on his Republican voters in the Senate than the Democratic leadership has on the House. Yeah. And I think that it's quite conceivable that over time, more and more Democratic senators may begin to feel the pressure and begin to be more willing to negotiate. In part because we represent constituencies that will be hurt. And there are already two or three, depending on how you count, who've been willing to vote for a continuing resolution. It wouldn't surprise me at all over the next few weeks if a movement emerges to try to negotiate an end. And it's hard to see how the shutdown could end without that.
So now I'd like to open it up. I really appreciate your comments, your thoughts, your questions. The one request is that you keep it brief. I was kidding that maybe we could do like the Oscars, where the shortest speech gets a prize, 2 tickets to Mark Parsons' Nose shows. How about that? Anyway, just please weigh in with your thoughts, any and all, because this is a conversation. No questions about politics here?
I just have a simple question that I haven't lived here that long, and you said in Pasadena was a Republican city. How long ago was that? I'm not familiar with it.
The last Republican representative was Carlos Moorhead, and I think that's right. Oh, no, actually Jim Rogan was probably the last.
Yes.
And Adam Schiff defeated him in 1996?
Year 2000.
Or was it 2000?
They tried to impeach, he led the impeachment of
Jim Rogan.
Clinton.
Oh, Clinton.
Rogan
Right, you're
led
right.
the impeachment
Yes,
of
it was 2000.
yeah.
But Rogan was an outlier by that time. Pasadena had been a rock-ribbed Republican, this whole area had been a Republican stronghold for decades. But by the time Rogan was defeated, Jack Scott was in the state Senate, Carol Liu was in the state assembly.
But we still had David Dreyer as our congressperson until well into the 2000s. He's a Republican, and he had a nice district that went out east.
Right, it depended a lot on how, as Republicans lost power in the area, often parts of this area would get attached to areas further east that were more conservative. But the core area, I would say the biggest change occurred probably right during the Clinton years. White suburban educated voters began to leave the Republican Party in big numbers. And that translated in places like ours into the Republicans losing control of areas they had held for decades.
Ed, you had a question, I think.
Oh, yeah, I'll let this guy go.
Yeah, go ahead,
He's
sir.
hand up right at the start, go ahead.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
You quoted a couple polls, and I was curious, are those local polls or are those national polls?
So the Prop 50 is an Emerson poll, which is a national organization.
But it's a statewide poll.
Statewide poll, yeah. And then the shutdown poll was CBS YouGov. Yeah.
And that's a national poll also. I just want to stress again, though, that historically, you would be wise to bet against Prop 50. It looks good now, but every one of you should vote because the turnout will be low. It's, as you know, I'm sure, day to day, talking to people, this is not at the top of people's minds. Many of them don't know there is an election. And even those who do, it's easy to just forget it. You know, from day I find myself from day to day thinking, oh yeah, the election's coming up, you know, which is odd for a person like me.
And
So-
also the traditional rule that Republicans vote more than Democrats will hold this time too. I mean, there are fewer Republicans perhaps, but, and also, by the way, Republicans in the room, we're trying to be a little objective here, but it's obviously, it's got a Democratic slant. Other questions? Ed, go ahead.
So I'm interested in Fred's comment and I'm looking ahead, not just on 50, but you made a comment like looking ahead into the 28 election. So 26, but into the 28 about the messaging. We're referring to young people, which are going to be 2 years older in 26 and 4 years older, whatever. The messaging about that Democrats have to have. In other words, getting off of this, what they're against, and developing something what they're for. What would be, in your opinion, the 2 or 3 issues that a candidate should get on board in messaging so that we have a positive messaging going forward about what we're going to accomplish as the Democratic Party?
Well, just as a preamble to answering that, in our system, there is no way for a party to reach a coherent platform or message apart from whoever wins the presidential primary.
Yeah.
That person defines the party's message.
Right.
And usually they win because they've defined it in a way that appeals to a majority or at least to a very sizable plurality of the party. And it takes great skill and hard work to, in a country as big and diverse as this, to find a message that keeps a broad coalition together without creating tremendous opportunities to be attacked from the other side. So that's the skill of running for president. And there are not many people who do it well, as we've seen in our lifetime. If I had to guess, I do think a unifying idea within the party will be the tremendous inequality in the economy. That the economy should no longer be run for billionaires, but should be run for ordinary people. And a series of proposals and actions that take that beyond rhetoric, because that's an easy thing to say, but we haven't had, it's not true that the Democratic Party hasn't had ideas about how to deal with equality. It is true that we've never been in position in Congress in the last couple of decades to have a sufficient majority to actually implement those kinds of ideas. So the next election will be crucial not only in terms of defining the path forward for both parties. You know, the Republicans have their own issue. Trump will be gone. Someone has to take his message and keep that coalition together. They have similar kinds of problems. But in defining for the future, not only defining for the future, but to be broad-based enough to bring into Congress a sufficient majority to deal with those kinds of issues. One issue that I'm sort of surprised hasn't begun to percolate, it may be because it is of most salience to older people, is that we are now very, very close to the time when Social Security will not go bankrupt in the sense of being unable to pay, but will fall, have run through essentially its trust fund, and will be going from day to day, which means about a 20% cut in Social Security benefits for the whole country, which, should it happen, would be a political earthquake. So I think something will happen, but the time is really quite short now. And it would be, I would guess that that may emerge as an issue. How to do that? Probably the Democratic position will be to take the cap off of Social Security contributions, which is now, I don't know, is it maybe 180, 180,000? It's fairly,
150, 160.
yeah, and let it float all the way to the top of the income level. There may be others, but that kind of, I'm guessing that kind of thing will be unifying for the party. There are other issues that may not be so.
I would add too, Fred, because I agree with you totally that the president, and whoever the nominee is going to determine. But just talking about, not necessarily about winning elections, but what's good for the country. I think the Democrats, before we come up with policy ideas and messaging, we need to take a hard look at reality. And the reality is the economic system is changing rapidly, technology world is changing rapidly, the level of inequalities happening, our international relations are different. So I think the first thing to do is to say where we are and where we're not. And we're certainly not in the kind of golden era, New Deal, post-World War II. And it's easy to say that, but I think we have to give up a lot of what are some of our preconditions and our traditional ideas about things like deficits, things like welfare, all kinds of things that we have to do another rethink on, and that we can reflect the reality of what's actually happening in the country. And then we can begin to think about some solutions, because this is very tough. And one of the reasons that it's super tough is because we have a system that doesn't really work well. I mean, it was designed not to work very efficiently. And I do think that we have to take a look at the unitary executive idea and say, all right, what kind, do we need a stronger presidency, and can we give it the guidelines within the law that'll be effective? Because what FDR did and what Teddy Roosevelt did and what Lincoln did were all very important, and that was the way they got some things done. So we have to get over, as Democrats, our reluctance just because it's Trump, that we automatically think, oh, we don't want that. More questions? Yeah, Phil.
Is it possible that we're thinking about the 2026 midterms in a conventional way, and that there might be some people in our country that will do everything they can to undermine the election, that they will steal ballot boxes, they'll put National Guard troops in front of every polling place?
You bet your life.
Probably there's one in the White
So
House.
it's not what's good for America, it is actual corruption of the whole system. Yes,
That is very true. There are some countervailing things, though. The states really run our elections. So if you want to be effective at sabotaging the midterms, you really have to do it state by state. Donald Trump can issue all the executive orders that he wants, but it comes down to what secretaries of state and other similar officials do. And there is a wall of resistance there. You'll notice it when the federal government has asked for the voter rolls from various states. It hasn't really mattered whether they were red or blue. They have said to this point, no, you're not entitled to that information. It's also true that the places where this kind of subterfuge could be most effective is the place where one party is in total control. And frankly, those places are not likely to be where the swing districts are. So, yes, I think the Republican Party under Donald, I don't want to impute this to the party per se, but clearly Donald Trump is perfectly willing and I think eager to subvert the election. And I will say that leaving aside illegality, he has already begun to develop a huge war chest. Much more successful fundraising the Democrats are doing, so that they'll have that as an extra bullet in their gun. I don't think that he is going to be able to prevent the election from happening, and I don't think he's going to be able to affect the results in terms of winners or losers in a significant number of seats. But, you know, who among us has not been surprised by things that he has already done and accomplished and that we thought we would never see? So, never say never.
Sir?
In my opinion, a big part of what you just said, what he has been allowed to do. What is your opinion of the Supreme Court and the decisions that they continue to hand down that do nothing more than empower a madman from becoming a dictator? And that baffles me.
Right. Well, I have several thoughts on that. As you can imagine, I share your frustration. It feels to me, and I'm hardly an expert on the Supreme Court, but it feels to me like the court right now is doing everything it can not to provoke a confrontation until it has to. Their rulings have been almost all procedural.
Right.
And they've basically been, he gets to do this now until the process plays out. But over the next year or so, the process will play out. And there will be some big decisions that the court will have to decide. Do we have birthright citizenship? Are we going to overturn the precedent from the 20s, the name of which I can't think of right now, but that basically protects against the executive impounding funds. There are a number of others about his ability to deal with the National Guard and others. These are all going to come to a point where the procedural hurdles have been cleared. My reading of the court is that we will be disappointed in many of the things they do, but that there is probably not a fifth vote for the most extreme cave-in to Trump. And that's part of the reason they have been holding back and declining to get to the issue. So we'll see. Obviously, the precedents that they've been willing to overturn already are breathtaking and disheartening. But that's my guess. And I also think several members of the court, John Roberts is the obvious one, are very conscious of their place in history. And things are happening now that are going to be very much scrutinized, and serious and severe judgments are going to be made about who did what at this time. And that's why I tend to think between Roberts and Comey Barrett and maybe even Kavanaugh and others, I think there are lines that this court will be unwilling to cross.
And I would say, Shakespeare famously talked about the law's delay in Hamlet, and I think this is something that Trump is the past master of, is using the law in ways to delay, any pushback. I'm also reminded of a quote from Erdogan of Turkey, who talked about democracy, and he said, democracy is like a trolley car. He said, you ride it until it takes you where you want to go, and then you get off. And I think that the thing about our democracy is it's so slow moving and cumbersome and inefficient it's probably a little more difficult to tear it down than it would be in Turkey or Hungary or some of the other places. In fact, it is harder, you know. So that's something. The fact that our system doesn't work very well is an advantage to us in these times.
Right, working very well is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
There are, in some sense, this is exactly what the founders wanted. They wanted it to be slow and difficult to make radical change.
Yeah.
Trump has shocked us all
Yeah.
by the degree of radical change he's been able to accomplish.
Well, I think the appeal too for our population and populations around the world is, gee, wouldn't it be great to have a guy like Xi Jinping, who Putin, or just says, go do it, and it happens. And in China, buildings go up in 3 months, and they fall down maybe in time too. But there's an appeal to that somebody can wave a magic wand. Questions, Janine?
Yeah, I have a question or a comment and a question. I
Yeah.
would say that my first comment is back to your question about messaging, and if we have any hope of reaching younger people, we have to change the way we're doing that.
Yeah.
They don't use email. They only use their phones. The AI. It's a different world out there, and if we don't adapt to that, it's going to be dangerous for all of us in the long run. That was just a comment.
Yeah.
But my question is that, they talk a lot about the lack of leadership in the Democratic Party and that there's no strong message, there's no strong leader. Do you, either of you or anybody in the room, have any idea of some of the people who might come to the surface? So I have a glimmer of hope inside of me.
Well, let me take a poll. Governor Pritzker, Cory Booker,
Anybody?
Your hand is going up.
Cory Booker, who else? Pete Buttigieg,
No. What about Gavin Newsom?
Gavin Newsom, sorry, Bobby. Gavin Newsom. All right, well, there you are. I mean, it's split 5 ways, I think. Josh Shapiro.
Mandami.
Mandani.
Seriously, he's the guy who's doing what we say needs to be
Right.
done. Which
He's
is
talking policy.
what?
Mondani talks policy.
He talks policy. He talks income inequality. He talks about young people. He talks about affordability.
He talks about real policies that will affect everyone's life, low income.
And even though he's a democratic socialist, whatever that might be,
Right.
and is he a Muslim?
Yeah.
And a Muslim, he's going to win in New York City.
Yes, he is. Although it does look like he will probably not get a majority. But it certainly looks like he will win. And you're absolutely right, his campaign has been a breath of fresh air and an instruction pamphlet, I think, for how to reach and engage a lot of voters. But that fact that
I mean, it is New York City, which is not
it's New York
the rest of the
City,
country.
and it's probably not the majority of New York City, which is significant. A Democratic candidate that cannot win New York City by 2/3 or whatever, or really 80%, has no shot at winning nationally. So one of the difficulties of the primaries for us and for the Republicans too is that I think the greatest initial enthusiasm is going to be for someone in the Mondani, Ocasio, Bernie sort of place. And I think those candidates and the folks around them have been better at messaging, better at prescribing, at coming up with ideas that at least feel to many voters like answers. They unfortunately have also been unable thus far to create a sense of comfort and possibility in the kind of the middle mass of the Democratic Party, let alone the rest of the country. And I think the interesting thing about the primaries over the next 2 years, and it'll probably take almost 2 years, will be to see if that kind of very, very progressive message can be expressed in a way that goes beyond the excitement of a very energized and important, but often younger and not majority group within the Democratic Party. Because-
Hoyt, 752.
Okay, thanks, Jake. Yeah, so just a comment on that, as the chair of the United Democratic Headquarters, which is an umbrella organization of different clubs and grassroots organizations throughout the San Gabriel Valley, west to Glendale and Burbank, and east to really almost Rancho Cucamonga. What I see is I see a split in the Democratic Party, and it's partly generational, but we have a real divide going on between, progressive and I would say moderate or traditional Democrats. And if you look at the polling, where you see that the Republicans, do you approve of Republicans, Democrats, and Republicans come out kind of even, maybe a little bit ahead of us in approval ratings. But the reason for that is that 50% of Democrats don't approve of us.
Right.
Okay, so this is something that, what I say is we're Democrats, this is what we do. We fight among ourselves about all these different issues. And, the idea of kind of somehow censoring Mandami or AOC or Bernie or that makes absolutely no sense, because they have a strong message that's receptive to a lot of people. It's not necessarily a winning message nationally, but it's something that we absolutely have to incorporate. And just looking at it here, which is a well-educated, fairly affluent, democratic, solid community, you're seeing these splits. And again, I'm saying it's not generational. It's got young, got old on all sides. But I'm seeing it a lot, and I think that it's part of the preparation that we're doing for 2028, because I do think we have a strong chance in 26. But I think 2028 is going to be when if we're going to defeat this MAGA movement, which is also important in addition to all our policy goals, I think we have to unify and have a message that appeals broadly. And we will. I really think we will.
I just wanted to, I didn't want to sound like I was dismissing that wing of the party.
Right.
I do think that this is the moment when that wing of the party, I think, should be at its peak in power and potential. Unfortunately, Bernie Sanders is too old to run, and I think even those who love him would probably agree with that. Mandani, if he wins the mayorship of New York City, is not going to launch a presidential campaign the next day. And Ocasio-Cortez does not seem to be on a presidential path. She seems perhaps to be on a senatorial path.
Yeah.
And so once you get, if you take those three out of the picture, finding someone with a national appeal is not easy or automatic. And the candidates, I think, that will start at the top of the polls, like Gavin Newsom, whom I suspect will start at the top of the polls, they're not moderates so much as they are not quite as progressive, let's put it that way, and trying to find a message that both appeals to the progressive wing of our party and also reaches out to the small but important middle ground outside our party. And that's, I think initially, especially because the second presidential primary, for right now, it may change. It looks like it'll be in South Carolina again. So a critical test early on is who can speak to the African American community in a way that energizes and legitimizes the appeal beyond their own, particular ideological place. And you remember, that's not automatic. You may remember even Barack Obama had significant difficulty convincing African American voters early in his primary season. They weren't sure he could win. They didn't believe it. So I mean, these are not voters that will be taken for granted. So far, they have not been very receptive to the most progressive candidates in the party. We'll see if that changes.
Time for one or two more? We good? We covered it? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Bobby?
Thank you, and thank you both very much. These are very interesting discussions at a time when we are in a very uncertain position. I'm curious about the attempt by President Trump to frame this debate in terms of the evil empire, reliving the old evil empire, waving the communist boogeyman, which he has already said he intends to do. He intends to frame the debate that way. And whether America is in a sense ready to address that long history of McCarthyism, and which it's clear that it's going to be a pretty ugly campaign in New York for Zoran Mandami. This is going to be then lead potential for a watershed election in the United States coming in next year or 2 years, which is something that people like us who are constantly caught up in the everyday cycle of it don't quite understand the grasp of that. But you know, President Roosevelt oversaw a watershed election which lasted for a long time. And the question is, what do you guys think about as the probability that this next election or the one after could be a true watershed election? Now, throwing that out, who would have thought a democratic socialist who's a Muslim